One of my favorite things to watch in 2024 was the rise of Lolcowlive. If you're not familiar, because maybe you're a normal human being with hobbies and tastes, I don't blame you, but essentially it's YouTube's premier podcast for 400-pound land monsters, Wings of Redemption, and Boogie2988, who's pretty much YouTube royalty from his Francis videos from back in the day, with Keemstar as kind of a tard wrangler of sorts. Throughout the past year, the show's actually had a pretty crazy development arc. The show actually started with a completely different tard wrangler named Tommy C that eventually had a falling out with the crew before Keemstar took over, which ended in Keem screaming about getting scammed because he didn't want to give Tommy the last month's pay because he felt like Tommy didn't do enough work. In the end, he didn't want to look like a bad guy, and Tommy didn't go down quietly, so he ended up giving him the last month's pay that he earned. At the end of the day, it just kind of shows what shaky footing the show was on from the start, and Keemstar's propensity to blow up a relationship as a knee-jerk reaction before he comes to his senses. Not long after Keemstar took over as the third host, Destiny sat down and did 5 minutes of research before coming to the conclusion that Boogie was probably lying about having cancer. So naturally, Keemstar brought Destiny onto the show live to confront him, which resulted in an absolute meltdown of screaming and crying, but no matter what he did, at the end of 2 hours of confrontation, it finally resulted in him pretty much admitting that he didn't have cancer. Now, Boogie took donations for this cancer, so Keemstar really had no choice but to fire Boogie from the show unless he completed a series of punishments to redeem himself to the members. These punishments included getting a liar face tattoo. He had to go out on the side of the road and clean up trash where he pretended to drink a bottle of piss that he found, and getting water ballooned in public. As you can tell, it's a real quality program they got running over there. All that aside, they've still managed to gather up a pretty significant amount of paying members, and every show they rake in a ton of super chats. So naturally, Keemstar's seen the fan interactions with various guests and come to the conclusion that he can use the platform as a sort of springboard to try and launch a Lolcow universe where he picks and chooses hosts like he's digging through a Goodwill Lego box to try and fit a team together that he thinks would make good content on a podcast of their own. He said his goal is developing a 48-hour spread of content airing every other day so you can watch Lolcow content all day, every day. And now that's an ambitious goal, and when I tell you he's slapping together a real motley crew of individuals over there, that doesn't even do it justice. His first spin-off podcast is called Lolcow Queens, and it involves a failed mean girl and RTU's ex-girlfriend, Becky Boop, Keem's almost legally brain-dead assistant, Lynx, who didn't make it past the first episode, Grace Thorpe, who also didn't make it past the first episode, but has managed to keep her name alive in the Lolcow universe despite that. And honestly, the second host that stayed, I don't even know how to describe other than the embodiment of white trash, and that's the nicest definition I can think of. Her name is Tina, and on one of their most recent live streams, there was literally a cockroach crawling across her couch on camera. This is sort of a joint venture between Keem and Kid Behind a Camera where they try to play YouTube's Jerry Springer. 9 times out of 10, it just devolves into 2 fat women from different walks of life yelling 480p insults at each other, and Becky having an emotional breakdown because I guess she's never been bullied in life and can't handle being called fat, but she also has a Harvard Extension School degree and genuinely believes that she's better than everyone. It's an absolute dumpster fire, and from pretty much day one, the comments have been a forum for Becky hate posts. On top of that, he's already started another show where 2 of the most unfunny and genuinely unentertaining people to ever get in a Discord call together recap the events of the other 2 shows, and a third show where 3 box blonde 40-year-old airheads with no experience podcasting and no relationship with each other than Keemstar sticking them together are supposed to make a cohesive podcast somehow. The only exception to the crew of degenerates that stood out was Grace Thorpe, and Keem kicking her to the curb before Lolcow Queens could take off is probably gonna haunt him for the foreseeable future. Now, Grace and Ben are literally an entire documentary of content all on their own, so I'll even link to an FPS Diesel video where he goes more in depth and explains their backstory a little bit in the description, but the spark notes of them is essentially Grace and her dad are a streaming duo who the internet alleges are in an incestuous relationship, and instead of being crystal clear like any sane father-daughter duo that that's not the case, instead they played into the accusations and continue to troll the audience over and over. There have been a lot of instances and breakdowns in which people have come to the conclusion that Ben is abusing Grace in every way you can think of, and we're not here to debunk whether or not that's true, but that's the crux of the argument for this whole situation. Grace was originally supposed to be the third host of Queens, but the other host didn't want to work with her unless Ben was completely removed from the picture because they didn't want to platform an abuser or pay an abuser. Now, Grace agreed to get away from Ben in order to secure a spot on Queens, and Keem kind of made arrangements for her to have a place to stay in Florida, so they drove down to Florida. Grace was going going to stay down there and Ben was going to drive back to Rhode Island, where they're from. After Grace was supposed to be on her own by this point, Ben was supposed to be on his way back to Rhode Island. They were doing a stream and Ben was heard laughing right next to Grace. So Keem really had no choice but to cut ties with her and start the show with just the two hosts. Now, all the abuse stuff aside and the ethical conversation of whether or not it's fair to tell Grace she can't have a relationship with her father if she wants to be on the show, Grace was a perfect host. She has a phenomenal personality for streaming. She's intelligent, she's well-spoken, she's attractive, she pays attention to donos and keeps the stream moving. She's flirty and interacts with the fans instead of just reviewing content like a lot of other streamers, and genuinely makes the streams feel engaging to her audience. Grace is also very creative, so when it came time to address the Lolcow situation, she came up with a plan that I don't think anybody could have expected. You see, slapping Lolcow on a podcast like it's a brand works to link Keem's shows together, but unfortunately for him, it's not some kind of trademark or branding he has ownership of, which means anyone can call their podcast Lolcow Mukbang and start eating 10 pounds of spicy noodles the same day, and Keem just has to smile and wave while they link onto the brand to try and siphon viewers. Once Grace figured this out, she started a new channel called Lolcow Rejects and started broadcasting before Keem's Lolcow podcast every day, even using a similar color scheme and design logo and the AI intro songs that Lolcowlive frequently uses. So for anyone who doesn't know any better, this just seems like another Lolcow Universe podcast. She's been relatively successful, having 400 viewers, which is relevant because Keem told her if she didn't do what he wanted to stay with Queen, she'd never crack 200 again, and having almost enough watch hours to get monetized by episode 3. By episode 8, they were monetized, collected $200 in super chats, and Keem's Cope and Seethe campaign has been nothing short of magical. So far, he's managed to say this is the last time we're talking about Grace and Ben a dozen times, and then proceeds to talk about Grace and Ben again. And for an episode he wasn't there and the other two hosts were running the show, they mentioned Grace, and Keem called in to tell them not to. It's so entrenched in his mind that he's at home taking a night off from the stream, and he's still keeping it up, making sure that nobody is talking about Grace. And when that doesn't work, he calls in to continue to talk about Grace. Truly a mega mind level play on his part. In the past episode on Thursday, Grace raided the Lolcowlive stream, so Keem would see that the Lolcow Rejects were raiding, and he had a mini freak out where he just started banning people as they came in. He banned a paid member for super chatting something with Grace's name by the 15-minute mark, and by the 25-minute mark, he'd banned a $50 a month paid member for another super chat. He's literally willing to jettison the people paying to support his projects just to try and get the one-up on Grace, and even his co-hosts have acknowledged how out of pocket that was. It's so bad that Grace went on to the previous host, Tommy C, Shot from the Point podcast, and when Keem found out, he had another minor meltdown over it on stream. Grace is set to have Keem's former co-host from a podcast he ran almost a decade ago with Tommy C called Baited, so it's safe to say he's not going to have a Grace-free day for a while. So stay tuned, it's going to continue to be a train wreck. The question I really have for you guys is, if you had to pick one between staying the night in Tina's Cockroach Castle or staying the night in the RV with Grace's dad Ben, which one would you pick?